So I grew up in on Papa's Chase land in a co-op, and I went to this school. It was in the 70s where somebody, I don't know who it was, that thought windows were bad for children. But sadly, that was the case. So I was a terrible student. I, like my five older sisters, did very poorly academically. They had reading groups that they would, instead of saying slow and fast, they would call it the turtle and the rabbit group, which one still kind of figured out what group they were in. And then suddenly, I went to an adult ed school in grade 11, and suddenly I went from being slow to being considered bright. And so this raised a whole bunch of questions for me around how do we decide who's slow and who's bright? And then from that, I started to learn American Sign Language. There were a number of deaf students in the school, and again was really interested in, well, for one, often people yelling at deaf students and wondering why they thought that was useful. But and a friend of mine who we're still very good friends, Dr. Heidi Jantz. So she used a wheelchair, and people would often ask me what she wanted for dinner or what she wanted for lunch. I'm like, am I a mind reader here, right? Why are you not asking her? So this for me raised a lot of questions early on, I guess, about what are the values associated behind who's seen as worthy and unworthy, or productive and unproductive? And so I invite you to just think about it even in your schools, right? Who's honored, right? Who, the student honor roll, for example. What's considered important and what's not? Productivity. When we hear the word productivity, what do we mean by that, right? So if somebody is, let's say somebody has straight A's, but they're, bullying other people, are they seen as productive, right? And so thinking about the values in terms of who we see as a good student and a bad student and how we come to that. Dr. Opini mentioned a lot of my research is around rankings. And rankings is something I became really interested in because at UBC we're highly ranked, and we would have meetings where we're told we're highly ranked and all clap. And then I thought I should look at why I'm clapping, and started to realize really how antithetical it is to talk about equity and talk about being highly ranked. What is being highly ranked? What's behind being highly ranked or being a plus student? What are the values behind it, right? What are we saying? And what's not important? What are we not counting? Oops, sorry. And so this for me gets at how we frame success. And reframing. So Dr. Deirdre Kelly, who works in ed studies, long ago did a study where she challenged the notion of dropouts, school dropouts, and instead said, let's talk about pushouts. So when I say the word dropout, and I have to stop sharing the screen if I'm going to see the chat, but if anybody wants to yell anything out, if I say the word dropout, what do you think of? Who's the problem if I say the word dropout? Anybody want to unmute themselves and yell anything out?
Maybe the student.
The student, yeah, the student's the problem, right? They've dropped out. How about if I say the word push out?
The school is the problem.
Yeah, so thinking about how we frame things is so important, right? Do we frame things as the kid's the problem, or do we look at it and say, okay, what's going on in the school? So I think of a couple examples. One, a number of years ago, I was working with a group of youth that went around the province and wrote about what were the issues that they saw for youth and how adults and policymakers could do something about those issues. So one of the young women I was working with, she got in trouble. She punched somebody, and she was about to get expelled from school. And so I was told, well, you're probably not going to want to have her in the project given her bad behavior. So I went to her, let's call her Mary, and I said, can you tell me what happened? And, why did you punch this other girl? And she said, finally it came out. For months, they had been making racist comments, particular to her, about First Nations and about her First Nation. And she had asked them to stop for months, and they hadn't. And one day she punched one of them in the mouth. Now, I look at that and I talk to the principal. I said, how about the girls how about that were making the racist comments? What's happening to them? Well, nothing, right? They didn't hit her. So the violence that was inflicted on her day in, day out, eventually she tried to respond with words. Eventually she punched somebody. So I look at that and think, okay, what's going on there? She was being pushed out, right? She was being pushed out of school. And so in that case, I looked at it and go, what was going on in the school, right? That made this behavior acceptable. When I brought up issues of systemic racism, it's like that's not an issue here. So that defensiveness that left the girl that punched somebody else in the situation of having no protection, no attention to the day-to-day acts of violence against her. Again, in looking at some of the intersections of disability and racism, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So normalizing oppression starts really young, right? And I invite you just to think about childhood TV shows or movies. Anybody, like for example, Disney. I don't know if anybody has seen, it's kind of a dated now, Mickey Mouse Monopoly. And so it's a show about Disney movies, and how often who's seen as the heroes in Disney movies, who's seen as the villains in Disney movies, right? Who are the princesses? What do the princesses look like, right? And even when there's characters that are racialized that are seen as the heroes, how are they essentialized in ways, right? So it's something to think about, is how these things, how we come to learn and misrecognize groups that we don't belong to often, and often our own groups, from these representations. And so the bus billboard there, so we learn early on in terms of who's valued and who's not. And so the bus billboard here says, let's wipe out cancer, diabetes, and autism in this lifetime. And so, yeah, so it's, I saw a shocked look on. So here's an example in terms of, and I've shown this to a number of people saying, well, what's the issue with that? Now to think about that in terms of, what does somebody with autism, how do they read that? Wipe out autism, right? So why I'm talking about disability and racism, I'm going to get to it, is how interconnected they are, right? How interconnected they are as structures of oppression. So just bear with me for a bit more. And so when we talk about how we come to see who are the knowers, right? Who are the knowledge makers versus the beneficiaries of knowledge. And so I think about my colleague, Dr. Ali Abdi, who's been very critical of high school students going to Africa, as if it's a country, going to the continent of Africa to build schools for children. And his question is, really, are we assuming that Africans can't build a school? I mean, the continent that built the pyramids, that has all these structures and architecture, and we're yet this sense that somehow high school students are needed to go and build Canadian high school students are needed to go and build schools there. And so this is really important, because what it says to those white students, or predominantly white students in Canada, is you are needed. You have knowledge that these people don't. They are inferior. You have to go and help them, right? And so it gets back into this sort of white savior mode, and it gets into a complete denial of the knowledge of an entire continent of people. And the other reason I raise this, and is in looking at this, also connects to thinking about how Canada comes to perceive itself as a helper, right? And so Dr. Basebo Pini talks about this in terms of, for example, Canadian corporations in the global mining industry that often are very much part of violent conflicts, very much part of people losing their lives or becoming impaired, and then not in any way providing support for those people, right? So, and then when those people become refugees, or some become refugees and Canada accepts, then saying, aren't we a nice country for accepting these people? Without looking at what is our role, or what is the Canadian government's role which we many of you support through your taxes and else and in other ways, role in um, actually creating situations where people become refugees or end up with impairments and end up disabled because of societal conditions and context. And so if we look at these hard questions, right, then we're in a different role. We are no longer the helpers, right? We're no longer the Canadian helpers that are helping the world, but then we have to look at the interconnections. We have to look at our privilege as connected to the oppression of people elsewhere, including the students in our class who may have had to leave their countries of origin because of conflicts that the Canadian people, Canadian government may have actually participated in. And so in looking at this, and the reason I raise this is so often we don't know about these things, right? But raising the question of why don't we know? And sometimes people talk about this as active ignorance, right? It's painful to know these things. It's much nicer to have a story of being this wonderful multicultural country that helps people around the world than to actually deal with some of the hard realities, right? Of the wealth that we have is based often on the oppression of others. And so if we come back and look here in Canada and look at residential schools, thinking about what is new for who and why. So after the uncovering of the graves in Kamloops, I contacted and did my students who are First Nations and colleagues to see how they were, and they were all like, "This isn't new to us, right? This is not new. This has been known. This has been said by the elders for decades, for years and years." And so this sort of concept of new and who is it new for? Who gets to say this is new for them? So if we think back to residential schools in 1907, Dr. Bryce, as Cindy Blackstock has brought forward, warns of health issues in residential schools. In 1915, there's an article that talks about it as close to as manslaughter. The Native Indian Brotherhood white paper in 1969, the final report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, all of these reports brought up systemic racism in Canada. And then Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who I believe is speaking at the faculty, as part of a Faculty of Ed talk in November. Dr. Cindy Blackstock for decades has been raising issues of the inequity of services for Indigenous children versus non-Indigenous children, particularly Indigenous children on reserve, right? They get less money in their education. For disabled children or for chronically ill children that aren't treated close to home, that don't have family with them. She has raised this over and over and over again. And so the question for me is, when do we, who gets to ignore these things, right? Who gets to sort of not know, and who has to know every day? Every day they're not allowed to forget because it's their lives, right? And so I think that just thinking about that, thinking about the politics of forgetting, right? And so I think about a couple of friends who sadly died this year, who were from New Chelmsford, and talked about, oh yeah, I mean that this is, we've seen this before, right? That we'll never forget again, but will we? Or will they? I mean, they didn't forget. They had dealt with much of it. Were dealing with the oppression of colonization. So the question is, how do we make a choice not to forget? It is a choice we can make. So for those of us that are white, that are non-Indigenous, is making that choice to say, I will not forget. Because it's really easy to forget. And as a country, we have forgotten over and over again. And so in terms of opposition, right? So this is the other question. Well, there was no opposition. We didn't know. Eugenics is another issue, right? So eugenics is very connected with racism. And eugenics is, until the 1970s, there was a eugenics board in Alberta and BC, and people were forcibly sterilized, many of them Indigenous and racialized. And so disability is so often seen as this horrible, terrible thing, was often used to condone violence, white supremacy towards Indigenous and racialized people. So this sort of sense of, oh, they're feeble-minded, they're disabled, right? So it's this, so ableism and racism are very much connected. But here, just like with residential schools, there was a lot of protest. There was a lot of opposition. It's not like people said, oh, we don't mind. There was opposition, but it gets to who was listened to, right? So who was seen as worthy of listening to, who was seen as worthy and having the knowledge to listen to. So if we go back to, if we go back to residential schools, there was learned professors, including at UBC, including in Alberta, including all over the country, who knowingly participated in experiments that malnourished Indigenous children, right, for science. And so we have to look at that and say, they were learned, they knew what they were doing, right? So how was it that was seen as acceptable, right? And it's not that there wasn't knowledge that it was causing harm. And so I raise this as a question of how do we think about today? Because it's a lot easier to look historically and go, how could they do that, right? But how do we look at our current moment and think about who are we not listening to today, right? Or whose voices are being ignored? And how do we change that so that we're not just responding as a profession? So in many ways, we think about the decades of struggle, the decades of Indigenous educators and saying, please stop this, and showing the harm and being ignored. How do we change that so we don't have to have that the people, we don't sort of watch as people die, and the oppression in the system until the point that it eventually is forced into some sort of public consciousness. And so I'm going to go into the whole notion of giving voice. And so we often hear this, well, we want to give people voice. This is a picture. It was a protest I was at back in 1989. I think that might be me in the pink pants. I hope not. But they're really bright pants. So I was at this protest, and this is a community that was had not known alcoholism, had not known suicide, it was very independent, and then oil and gas was found. And this was in Alberta. And basically their land was destroyed. And they protested. They went to the United Nations. Canada was told to smarten up, but did not. Eventually, in the last couple of years, an agreement was reached. I raise this here because I remember going in thinking, well, this is terrible. We just have to tell people, right? And getting a good lesson. And it wasn't an issue of people not knowing how to have a voice. They had a voice for themselves. They sure as heck didn't need me for that, right? Solidarity meant being there, not being the leader, right? And in my own, standing up in my classes and elsewhere to challenge racism. But to think about solidarity and what solidarity meant. And I think back to that time, and in many ways, what a burden I would have been there in my lack of knowledge and understanding, and the generosity of people in trying to explain, and also in explaining sometimes action, particularly action by settlers, can be more harmful when they haven't critically reflected, and when they're not doing what they're being asked to do by elders and by organizers at the protests, such as this one. I also worked at an office that investigated child deaths and children in care, and again would work with youth who were incredibly articulate. They knew what they needed, and yet the issue was getting media and others to just give them a chance to speak. And when they did, it was always like, oh, they're so articulate. I worked with a group of youth, disabled youth, that again, it's like, well, you can't put them on the radio. And they were incredibly articulate about their needs and talking about ableism and talking about the issue for them wasn't using a wheelchair or using sign language, but the issue was people thinking they weren't capable. So I think about solid invitations to be in solidarity. And so, in the last year, Tyler White, the picture at the bottom there, is a First Nations leader who was very articulate against the expansion of medical assistance in dying to disabled people. So, and this may come as a surprise, is often so there was an expansion to include disabled people, people that aren't ill or close to the end of their lives, but disabled, very different. And his point was, he was saying Indigenous people that are facing racism, that are facing poverty, it's now going to be easier for them to get made and puts Canadians off the hook for housing and for dealing with poverty and racism. Sarah Jama similarly spoke about how it'll be easier to get made than to get decent housing. And so these are people that is today that aren't being heard, right? That I think that in 20 years will most likely be saying, oh, we didn't know. But looking at their voices and why they haven't been highlighted in the current debates. Now, I don't know if anybody has heard about the young woman, Skyla Hart, who refused to stand up for O Canada. And so this just happened a couple weeks ago. And I raised this because these are current examples where we can choose to be in solidarity, right? Or we can choose to at least listen and say, boy, I haven't heard these perspectives. Why haven't I heard these perspectives? Or if the feeling of anger, if you feel anger when a Skyla Hart refuses to stand up, to really reflect on what's that anger about? Why were people so angry that she refused to stand up, rather than saying, wow, that's a courageous act. Here's another example, is the people with Down syndrome that have started a campaign called to apply to be the first people to be on the endangered list. And the issue here is, and there's a number of public service announcements where people with Down syndrome are saying, why, I'm important to the human diversity. I'm an important part of society. Why do you want to get rid of people with Down syndrome? And again, thinking about it in terms of often this fear of disability and where is that coming from, right? And understanding a part of that is those sort of colonial values around productivity and unproductive, and how we come to our understandings of that, and how our understandings of that may be very, very different than people who we see as having a lesser quality of life. And this gets me to the whole question of identity first versus people first language. And this is one I've been corrected on. So I definitely in my earlier education was like people first language, right? So and so in other words, a person with autism, not an autistic person. And I thank a number of people who have schooled me on this. My best friend, Dr. Heidi Jantz, who's a disability studies scholar, and Dr. Laura Balk, who was a doctoral student of mine. And so Dr. Balk, says, well, I don't say I'm a person who's a woman. Why would I say I'm a person who is blind? Being blind is a part of my identity. I'm a blind person. I'm a woman, right? Is how she talks about herself. So what's important here, though, is not that I'm saying to you from now on, use identity first language, but to ask people, right? Is to ask people how they identify and how they talk about themselves. And so here I like this little cartoon. It's a great cartoon, Crippen. And you have a doc saying, what do you think they want? And then people in the background saying, to make our own decisions, to be asked. So again, is to be treated with respect, is to think about who do we ask, who do we see as having the right to be asked about how they identify. Whoops. Okay, and so we're gonna, do we have time? Yes, we do. So the question of who's present and who is absent, and Brad got at this morning as well, right? Is, who decides, right? Who decides what's in the courses? Who decides what knowledge is taught, who the knowledge keepers are, and who's absent and who's present in that. And so, what I would like you to do, just to have a bit of a break from me blabbing, is we're going to just go in a short breakout room. And what I want you to do is to think about your school and think about where are different classrooms and offices located and what this information tells you. So, for example, think about the wheelchair accessible door, right? Where is that? Is it in the back of the school, the front? How about the areas where kids might and adults might socialize? What does that look like? So think about how people move through that space. And I'm not just thinking about people who use wheelchairs, but think about elders, think about what kind of symbolism people see, who do they see represented, and what that tells you about who's valued and what knowledge counts.
I can speak to what our group was talking
Awesome.
about. We said that accessibility for people with different abilities, especially in the older schools, you can tell that that was not a priority ever back in the day, and that although accommodations are made if we have a student with varying abilities, it's not something that's a priority still. And we also commented on when you first come into the space in a lot of schools, what seems to be revered is sporting events and trophies and highlighting the great abilities of people who can move in typical ways.
Great, good points. Anyone else?
I can talk a little.
Yeah.
We talked about in our group how the schools seem to really prioritize and emphasize competition and like being the best at sports or academics and really valuing a certain achievement level versus more innate qualities that would more value everybody. And then one of our group members talked a little bit about how elementary schools in particular seem to really value being extroverted and loud, and if you can do public speaking. And so more introverted, quiet, introspective students might not feel as valued or like what they bring means as much.
Great. Awesome. Nadia, did you have something come up on my screen? Nope. Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, so I maybe I'll send you a video I did with my colleague, Dr. Heidi Jantz. And so we did a video of the new Ponderosa building that those of you at UBC will know. And we looked at how what the assumptions were in terms of who moves in that space in what role. So if she was a professor in that space, Heidi wouldn't be able to, for example, often access the controls because they were up, really high. Or the console that wasn't movable, or lack of space in between. And so just thinking about things like that, like even how often the elevator is broken, or social spaces. What do social spaces assume about the way people move through space? Great example of sports trophies, or even the imagery that's up on the wall. Who's valued and who's not, and what does that say right when a person walks in, or where the wheelchair entrance is. And this isn't just about this is about mobility, but also other kinds of ways people move and think through space. And so I think an important question to ask is just who's involved, right, in developing those spaces and who's not. Ponderosa, the building, I mean, when I went through with Dr. Jan, she's like, well, who did they consult in creating this? Because if they had consulted people with expertise who are and lived experience, some of these errors wouldn't have been made. And again, thinking through who do we assume and what do we assume about their roles in moving through space. Okay, so I want to talk as well just about, actually, first of all, does anybody recognize this image? Does anybody know who this is or who these characters are? Feel free to unmute.
The famous five.
The famous five. Awesome. Okay, well, who were the famous five?
The women who fought the Persons case in the Privy Council in England for women to be acknowledged as persons by the law.
Right. Okay. And what women were acknowledged at that point?
White middle class women.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it was white middle class women that were acknowledged. And does anybody know what 4 of these women were also known for?
I believe most of them were active in the eugenics movement.
That's right. Yeah, perfect. Okay, not perfect, but really, this is really important. So the reason I raise this issue is that you can have a group that understands one kind of oppression and very much participates in another form of oppression, right? So they understood how they were oppressed as white women. It doesn't translate necessarily to understanding of oppression, of racialized, of indigenous people, of disabled people. And so looking at that in terms of the importance of positionality and the importance of thinking about how the complexity, but also the interconnections of oppression. And sorry, I'm just noticing a note here in the chat I just want to go back to. Do people want to speak to your chats here? Somebody was mentioning building a ramp doesn't always solve the problem. Do you want to speak to that?
I can speak to that.
That'd be wonderful.
Being a part-time wheelchair user, I find that a lot of spaces are created without somebody actually using a wheelchair.
Yeah.
Because when you try to go up some of those ramps, if you don't have somebody assisting you to push you up, the amount of strength it takes to get up it, your chance of wheeling backwards and giving yourself a head injury are extremely high. Like I've already found a few places on UBC campus that are inaccessible, even though they have a ramp.
Yeah.
And then the some of the sharp corners or things you have to try to navigate to get around. So I have a thin chair, but if I had a regular size chair, it's even more inaccessible to get into some spaces, and kick plates that don't work. So now you can't get in and out of doors unless somebody's there. So I think that a lot of times there's good intentions, but they don't understand and how like the electric chairs are changing things, but now electric chairs often need a different space. So now you need to look at, or if you're a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, so there's all these different things that now need to be taken into account for as well when you're creating it. And the amount of uneven space to get from one building to another on campus is really challenging, and long slopes that are not manageable if you're self-propelling. So those are just some of the things I've noticed.
Really good examples of just how dangerous and it gets back to whose knowledge counts and who's part of deciding what's accessible. The funny story, years ago, I was in New York with my friend Heidi, and we were at a conference, so we couldn't find an accessible washroom. And I went up to one of the security guards, and he says, no, American Disabilities Act, all the washrooms are accessible. They have stickers on them that say they're accessible. And I said, but they're not, right? And so Heidi said, come on, get them to come in and show us how it's accessible. And so he was so sure it had to be, but it wasn't, because electric chairs are much wider. And if somebody needs to go in, it's a whole different situation. And so again, it's like who decided, right? And who was excluded from that decision, and what would it look like if people impacted by decisions were actually part of those decisions. I just want to go to another comment brought out how many schools have Indigenous totem poles and other art in the front entrance, but information is rarely accessible. Do you want to comment on that and why you think that is? I think it's Jing Ying.
Okay, it was somebody else in the group who brought this out, but I once they said that, I said, yes, that's so true. And often staff, not just students, but also staff don't know when you ask them, they have no idea who did it, from what nation, was it local, not.
Yeah.
What are the stories behind it? What was the artist representing?
Yeah, really good points. Okay, and this gets me, thank you, to the next thing I want to comment a bit on is how distancing happens. And so one of the things that after the murder of George Floyd, that it really got me questioning, why is it now? Why haven't we been talking about this for decades, for more than decades? And the fact is that Black scholars have been, and others have been, right, talking about racism in Canada, talking about police brutality towards racialized and Indigenous people. And so why weren't statements of solidarity made, right? And what does it take for those statements to be made? And it gets to sometimes the sort of sense that Canada is better, right? Not acknowledging the pain of racism here. And so I just invite people to think about it, to think about what, again, it's my question I had at the beginning, is what does it take to notice and to act and to really think about what's happening in Canada, what are things that we're complicit in different ways depending on how we're positioned are affected by. And how you hear, or what kind of reassurance you might want that things are better and where that's coming from. Okay, and now I'm going to move on just briefly in terms of thinking about that reassurance, or I know I was certainly taught very early on, we're this equitable country where everybody has an equal chance and multicultural, and as Gillian's saying, is the benevolent and kind country, quoted from Colonization Road, yes. And so thinking about that and thinking about how that impacts the way we see our schools and the way we see success in schools. And so here I have the Fraser Institute reporting of schools. Does anybody notice anything here about the top ranked schools? So that's
They're private. They cost a lot of money to attend.
They're private. They cost a lot of money, right? And how about the ones that are ranked much lower?
A lot of them are in like the east side of Vancouver, our public schools, and I think serve a lot of at-risk students. Yeah.
And what makes students at risk? It's a great point. What makes them at risk?
The environment they're in.
The environment they're in?
Socioeconomic background of their families.
Socioeconomic background?
Court systems.
Court systems? Racism? So yeah, social determinants of health, right. Yeah, so thinking about court systems, poverty, why are they poor? Right? And so this gets at a really important issue is if we look at things like social determinants of health, so if we don't look at social determinants of health, it seems like a mystery that Indigenous people have higher rates may have higher rates in the prisons or of alcoholism. But then if we look at social determinants and we say, okay, if somebody's dealing with racism, white supremacy day in, day out, that's going to have an effect on their health and does have an effect on their health, right? And so then the issue becomes racism, right? Not so much, oh, this person, is drinking too much, or this person dropped out of school, but it becomes they are being put at risk by racism, right? Or by ableism. And so then the reason this is so important is how we frame a problem is crucial to how we see solutions. So if we see the problem, right, as dropouts, then the problem becomes how do we remedy the child? How do we fix the child? But if the issue is they're being pushed out, then it becomes how do we deal with the system and deal with our own racism and how the system is structured. And so here in looking at the schools is looking at, and it's also what do we see as what counts? And so if I look at the top schools, so what counts is good grades, doing really well in an admissions test, having a family with money, it doesn't necessarily mean kindness or care for the environment or care for others. And so it's also looking at what puts society at risk, right? So I look to this, and this is where my research on university rankings comes in. And K-12 rankings is what do we value? And so if I look at university rankings, it gets to, well, what is the grade point average of students coming in, right? How much do the academics publish in English journals? What's not included is, for example, you might have top graduates from Harvard who might be involved in war crimes, or who are involved in Enron, or involved in other, or if we look at the varsity blues scandal, the college admission scandal, where you had very wealthy people paying their way in, their children's way into top ranked schools, and those top ranked schools participating in that. Doesn't mean all top ranked schools are terrible, but what it does mean is what do we value and what do we not? And so in this kind of ranking, who gets seen as important and who doesn't? And so I'm just going to go on. So reputation and equity. So this is a funny story. Princeton Law School is in the top 20. Now, the only issue with that is Princeton doesn't have a law school, right? So why do you think in a survey people were asked, what's the top law school? And a very high number of them said Princeton. Why do you think that is?
You were bribed?
Nope. Could be, but nope. They were asked, what do you think is the best law school? So I think it's because it's based on reputation. So even Princeton University has a great reputation, right? So people were asked, well, what's the best law school? Princeton. So even though it doesn't have a law school, people don't know anything about it. They put Princeton because they've heard the word Princeton. Similarly, when I was I was giving a talk on rankings to a group of engineers in Serbia, and I had one professor close to retirement came up to me, and he got kind of teary-eyed. He said, I've worked in the States for years. I could never say the best education I received was in Serbia because people would look at me and think I couldn't be a real professor. They couldn't accept that my best education was not in America or not in Canada. When I was in India, similarly, I was talking to a group of women professors at a women's university who were saying, we had students that went to a top-ranked school, were treated horribly, had to deal with incredible racism. Here, we're in a university focused on equity. If the rankings focused on equity, we would be number one and Harvard wouldn't. The reason I raise this is it gets back to who we value and what we value. And this is fundamental, in my mind, to looking at decolonizing. Because if we're always seeing the knowledge producers as predominantly white and male, then it becomes very difficult to see what we can learn and the importance of learning from other people, and to think about the global crisis we're in. And is our sort of sense of who has knowledge and what knowledge counts, is it serving the planet well? Or do we need to expand that and rethink what we value, given the context we're in? And so in looking at that, I look at the psychology of decolonizing. And I look at how, even though I'm critical of rankings, when UBC's up in the rankings, yes, it's like, oh, we're special. But having to question that. And so part of decolonizing is questioning that sort of desire to be special, and that desire to be special at the cost of others. So when we look at universities we see as top, I think about Dr. Michael Marker, who Brad mentioned, who died this year. And he talks about, I'm trying to get the chat. He talks about, I'll quote him, acknowledging that universities are slow to renovate their ethos and that they continue to perpetuate an assimilation supremacy. Indigenous faculty and graduate students have been struggling to assert a kind of cultural and intellectual sovereignty over their own academic production and participation. Universities are in an increasingly paradoxical position as they ostensibly invite Indigenous expression but resist the ongoing hierarchies that maintain hegemonic equilibrium. And I would say that Dr. Michael's Marker's words are really important to thinking about the contradictions, right? Thinking about the contradictions of talking about equity, of talking about anti-racism, of anti-ableism, but at the same time continuing to structure ourselves, our schools and universities in ways that are antithetical to becoming a more equitable society. Oops. And so this raises questions of what makes us better, and what would it look like to say, okay, how do we learn together? Because think about what happens with rankings is that groups that see themselves as similar, so the high ranked, start just associating with the other high ranked, right? And it perpetuates this system of hierarchies. So what would it look like instead of participating in rankings is to say, okay, what would it look like to learn from the First Nations University of Canada, from Gallaudet, which is a well-known university for the primary language of instruction is American Sign Language, or Mondragon in Spain, which is a cooperative university. So just to think about what would it look like to learn and to expand the way that we think about knowledge. And with that, I think I'm out of time, my goodness. I just wanted to very quickly quote Dr. Sensoy, who talks about how she often hears people saying, oh, but it's so hard, and what if I make a mistake? And she says, but people commit themselves to doing a lot of hard work, and her point is, it is hard, but we can do it. And with that, I want to I didn't do this at the beginning because I was scared I would become a blubbering mess. And that is to thank 4 courageous teachers and mentors of mine who died this year. And so Dance Williams and Frank Williams, they invited me to go with them to UBC when they gave a class. And Dance sat there in the back carving a hummingbird and said to the students assembled, it was an economics class, I'm a student too, because in my culture, if you're not learning, you're dead. They were incredible teachers, incredible carvers. They died within 6 weeks of each other. But from them, I think they taught so much to the commercial drive community. They knew more about that community than anybody else did. But I really want to sort of stick with that point of, if you're alive, you're learning, you're a student, and how to use that responsibly. I'd also like to remember Dr. Michael Marker and Dr. Vicki Drader. And I'm going to stop sharing.